All right, so we're going to head into the cardiovascular system. So we're going to start by looking at the heart. We already looked at the blood, which is part of the cardiovascular system, but now we're going to look through the heart. And like I said, a lot of this is going to be review. So before we actually go into the notes, I want to take out your lab lists, and I just want to go through some of the structures that you're going to see on the lab list. So this picture right here is showing the heart, and then it's showing the blood vessels that are, it's showing kind of the direction of the blood flow. So that is something that you're going to need to know. Deoxygenated blood is coming into the right atrium, and we're going to go over this in a little bit. And then that blood is going to go into the left and into the right ventricle. From the right ventricle, blood leaves through the pulmonary trunk. The pulmonary trunk then splits into a right and a left pulmonary artery because blood's going away from the heart. And that blood will go to the lungs where it'll get oxygenated, and then it's going to come back to the heart through the pulmonary veins, right? And when it comes back to the heart, it's going to come to the left side of the heart into the left atrium and then into the left ventricle. And from the left ventricle, it's going to pump the blood out through the aorta, which will deliver the blood to the systemic arteries and veins, okay? So we are going to go through all of those things, right? But let's take a look at your lab list. So let's talk about the blood flow again. I went through that kind of quick. You guys probably remember that from last semester anyway, but we're just going to talk about it again. So I'm going to start with the right side of the heart. So the right side of the heart is bringing back deoxygenated blood from the tissues. The tissues have used up the oxygen, so now we have the deoxyhemoglobin. So the blood's going to be like a dark red. I'm going to use blue as the color, all right? So the blood is coming back to the heart. It's blue, and it's going to enter through the superior vena cava and the inferior vena cava, and it's going to enter into that right atrium. Okay. And from there, then, the same deoxygenated blood is going to flow into the right ventricle. Right. And from there, the blood will flow into the pulmonary trunk, and the pulmonary trunk divides into the left pulmonary artery and the right pulmonary artery. Blood is going to go to the lungs then, and it's going to pick up oxygen. So now it becomes oxyhemoglobin, and the blood's going to look bright red. Those red blood cells are going to carry oxyhemoglobin, and so now that blood coming back to the heart is going to be a bright red. It's going to come back to the left atrium through the left pulmonary veins and the right pulmonary veins, and they're both going to flow into the left atrium. Okay. So the left and right of those pulmonary veins just tells you which lung is it coming from. From there, the blood will flow into the left ventricle. Right? So blood goes into the left ventricle. And from there, the blood is going to move out into this aorta. And the aorta has different parts to it. It has a little ascending, a very short little ascending, and then it has an arch, and then it's going to go all the way down through the thoracic and abdominal areas as the descending aorta in the thoracic area, and then the abdominal aorta as soon as it gets past that diaphragm. Okay. A couple of branches coming off of there that we're going to talk about later, the brachiocephalic trunk, and then the left common carotid and the left subclavian arteries, and we'll talk about those when we get to chapter 21. So what I'd suggest that you do is a little coloring when you get home and labeling. This also has the coronary vessels on it, so you're able to, label those. That would be a good idea. So one thing I do want to mention about the coronary blood vessels, and we can see on here, again, the coronary blood vessels are the blood vessels that are going to supply the heart tissue itself instead of supplying the rest of the body with blood. So on here you can see the right coronary blood vessel, the right coronary artery, and then there's also a left coronary artery, right? So, and that one we can't see so well on here, but they're coming off of the aorta. And the thing is that these coronary arteries are only going to be able to fill when the ventricles are relaxed. So when the ventricles are pumping, and I'll talk about this again, but when the ventricles pump and it pushes open that aortic valve, which I'll show you in a second, when it opens up that aortic valve, the aortic valve closes up these coronary openings, so then they can't get any blood. But as soon as the ventricles relax, then those aortic valves, they relax too, and then the openings are exposed, and then blood can go in there. So the heart really can only receive blood and oxygen when the ventricles are not contracting. So if the ventricles are contracting very rapidly, then the tissues in your heart have a higher chance of becoming ischemic or having less oxygen, right? Okay. Right, so again, let me show you that right here. We have the two coronary vessels coming off of the aorta. They'd be coming off of here and here, right? And so this right here, this is your aortic valve or your aortic semilunar valve. When the ventricle contracts, that valve actually closes up over the openings of those coronary vessels, and it closes them off so they can't get any blood, right? And it's only when the ventricles relax that the valve goes back to its normal position, and now those openings are exposed. Okay? All right, a couple of things about the conducting system then. So the cardiac muscle tissue, it's going to contract on its own, and we call that autorhythmicity. And the cells that are involved in that are not the cells that actually do the contraction. They're specialized cells, and I did talk about those when I showed you where they were on the diagram. But the cells that are called the pacemaker cells, that's the SA node. So that group of cells in the heart that is the pacemaker cells, those are called the SA nodes. And they're the ones that are going to, they spontaneously depolarize, and they cause the atria to contract. Okay. What I mean by spontaneously depolarize is when we looked at the nervous system and we said that resting membrane potential just stayed nice and flat until there was stimulation, that doesn't happen here. So if we look at, there's our resting membrane potential and there's threshold, right? In a normal neuron that we've been talking about, we said that it takes a stimulus in order to open those sodium gates to be able to reach threshold and then have an action potential, okay? Takes a stimulus. But when we're talking about the SA node, it spontaneously depolarizes, which tells us that it is not sitting still at negative 70 millivolts, it's actually going to spontaneously depolarize on its own without a stimulus, and then an action potential will occur. So it's spontaneous. It does not require a stimulus. No stimulus required. Okay? So then the SA node just starts discharging action potentials spontaneously. And the SA node will discharge 80 to 100 action potentials per minute. And so as soon as it discharges those action potentials, then the atria are going to contract. As soon as the atria contract, then the ventricles would contract. But is your heart rate normally 80 to 100 action potentials per minute? Not usually. It's usually slower, right? And the reason for that is that the parasympathetic nervous system has some control over that SA node. And it's going to slow it down, right? That's what the parasympathetic nervous system does. Binds to those muscarinic receptors and slows down the SA node. So the SA node's not going to beat so fast. All right, so it'll slow it down somewhere to maybe 70. It's probably 60 to 70 beats per minute. So 60 to 70 action potentials per minute is what it gets slowed down to. Now from there then, as soon as the SA node starts to discharge, the action potentials travel down those special cells in the atria through the internodal pathways, and they make their way to the AV node. So now this is the AV node. The AV node is in between the atria and the ventricles, and that's why we call these pathways the internodal pathways, right? They're internodal, in between the nodes. Now the AV node, this one will not spontaneously discharge action potentials unless something happens to the SA node. And if it does start spontaneously, if something happens to the SA node and the AV node takes over, it's only going to discharge 40 action potentials per minute, which is only going to give you 40 beats per minute, which is going to be quite slow. And that's not going to be enough long term or in any type of exertion to give oxygen to the rest of your body. Okay. From the AV node then, at the AV node, there is a 100 millisecond delay. 100 millisecond delay. And the reason for this is because you don't want the atria and the ventricles contracting at the same time. You want the atria to contract first, and then the AV node gets the message, and then the AV node sends the contraction or the action potentials out through the bundle, and then through the bundle branches, and then through the Purkinje fibers, and then the ventricles contract. But you have to have that 100 millisecond delay. Otherwise, they're going to contract too close together. Okay. So the maximum that the AV node can, it's really all about the ventricles contracting. The ventricles are what's important. The ventricles are what's pushing the blood to the rest of your body. So it's really all about the ventricles. So the AV node, if it speeds up, you're going to have less time for filling the ventricles. And we'll talk about that the next time that we meet. But the maximum that the AV node can send out, the maximum action potentials that it can send out, is 230 beats per minute. Right? So did you guys all watch the news the other day? Was it last week when some high school kid was wearing his Apple Watch and it actually picked up that his heart was beating over 200 beats per minute? No, you didn't catch that? So he's sitting in class and the thing's going off and he texts his mom and says, "Oh, I think there's a problem. My watch says my heart's beating at 210 beats per minute or whatever." So they went in and they found out that he had a heart condition. But yeah, so that's way too fast, way too fast. The ventricles are not going to be able to pump out, they're going to be squeezed pretty much the whole time, and you're not going to get any blood coming out of the ventricles. So, okay. All right. Now, what we want to talk about is, so when the heart is beating faster than it should, like if it's beating over 100 beats per minute, then we would call that tachycardia. So tachycardia is when the heart rate, which is how many beats per minute, that's what heart rate is, when the heart rate is over 100 beats per minute. Okay, too fast. Ventricles are not able to push out enough blood. The opposite would be called bradycardia, and bradycardia is when the heart rate is less than 60 beats per minute. Okay, so we got bradycardia and we got tachycardia. We're going to see this on the ECG readings when we look at it. All right. Now, another thing could happen, and that is that if the heart has an ectopic cell, so here you have your heart, and there's your SA node, and your AV node, and your bundle, and your branches, and your Purkinje, right? Sometimes there's such a thing as an ectopic cell, ectopic pacemaker cell, that's somewhere. Maybe it's in the atria or maybe it's in the ventricles, but it's kind of gone rogue and it is creating its own action potentials. And in that case, we're going to see extra contractions of the heart if that happens. It'll cause, it's something other than the SA node or the AV node causing action potentials to occur. Those are ectopic pacemaker cells. Okay, now let's look at the ECG or the electrocardiogram. Where is it here? Did I take it off? Okay. All right, so we're going to actually do an ECG on Tuesday. And we're going to have one person in your group. You're going to have, there's a couple of things we're going to do. We're going to do blood pressures, and then we're going to do an ECG on one person in your group. So you'll be able to get into whatever groups you want. You're going to put the, we'll talk about it, but you're going to put the leads on, and then we're going to print out a reading, and you're going to be able to see the conduction of those cells, you know, when the atria depolarize, when the ventricles depolarize, and then when they repolarize or relax. So we want to take a look at an actual ECG reading to kind of get an idea of what is normal. Okay, so when we're looking at an ECG reading, this is what we see. We're going to start down here. Now, you're going to see two different things. You're going to see a depolarization and you're going to see a repolarization. So a depolarization is when those sodium gates open up and you get a contraction. Repolarization are when those potassium gates open up and you get a relaxation. So that's the two. So if you can think of it that way, depolarization is contraction, repolarization leads to relaxation. Okay? So when we're looking at this, we see and we call this a sinus rhythm because we're looking at how the rhythm of the SA node and the AV node and all of those pathways are working. The first little bump that we see on this diagram here is called the P wave. And the P wave is when the atria depolarize. Okay? So we're just looking at the electrical activity of the heart, and that means that the SA node put out the action potential, and the action potential went down through the internodal pathways, and the atria, the cells, the contractile cells, are going to depolarize, right? And right after that depolarization, you get a contraction. So you might as well just say that when you see that P wave, you're getting depolarization, atrial depolarization, and atrial contraction, because it happens that fast, right? Then that electrical activity is going to get to the ventricles. And so we have this other, we call it the QRS wave, okay, QRS. And the QRS wave is ventricle depolarization. Ventricle depolarization. Now, the one thing here, so you get ventricle depolarization and then the ventricles contract right away. One thing that we didn't say we had, though, was the atrial repolarization. So you want the atria to rest before the ventricles contract, right? You don't want them to contract at the same time. The atria contract and then the ventricles contract. So you should have atrial contraction, atrial relaxation, ventricle contraction, ventricular relaxation, right? Does that make sense? But this QRS wave is so big that you can't even see the atrial repolarization. So underneath that on the chart that you can't even see, you do get atrial repolarization. So the atria are resting at the same time that the ventricles are depolarizing. You just can't see it because that QRS wave is so big. Make sense? But what you can see is when the ventricles relax, and that is called the T wave. So that's ventricular repolarization. Right? So we can see the P wave, which is atrial depolarization, QRS, which is ventricular depolarization, and then the T wave, which is ventricular repolarization. Contraction, contraction, rest. We just can't see the atria relaxing. That's all, right? We can also see some intervals, and intervals are important for us to recognize as well. An interval is the start of, it's the start of one point to the start of another. It's not really showing just a specific bump. So one of the intervals that we have is called the PR interval. And the PR interval is from the start of the P wave to the start of the QRS wave or QRS complex, right? So it's from the start to the start, and that's called the PR interval. So what we're looking at there is how long does it take from the time the atria contract to the time that the ventricles contract? How long does it take? Right? If it's lengthened, then there's something wrong. Maybe there's something wrong with the pathway. You're not getting those action potentials to the ventricles on time. Okay? Then we have the QT interval, and the QT interval is from the end of that PR interval to the end of the T wave. So now you're basically looking at the time between the ventricle contracting and the end of the ventricle relaxing. So there might be some things that are going to interfere with that. Okay. All right, so if we're looking at an abnormal action potential, then that is called an arrhythmia. Arrhythmia. And I think that there's a few arrhythmias that you should be able to identify, right? So I'm going to just talk about those, and then I'm going to give you a sheet and let you guys try to figure out what they are. So the first one, let's talk about arrhythmias in the atrium. So we would call these atrial, let me switch to a different color, atrial arrhythmias. The first atrial arrhythmia that we have is called a PAC, or a premature atrial contraction. It's premature. So you're basically going to have a normal sinus rhythm, but then you're not going to have a, normally you'd have a nice long, you'd have a longer interval there. You're not going to have that. Instead, it's going to be a real short interval. You're going to get another premature atrial contraction and then another action potential. Okay, so okay, it's kind of, if you think about it, a premature atrial contraction, you're going to get a surprise, basically a surprise atrial contraction. You'll see an extra atrial contraction in there, is basically what you're going to see. Then the second one is called a atrial tachycardia. We like to call it paroxysmal atrial tachycardia because it's going to, it's not always there. So paroxysmal means it's just not always there. But in this case, there's going to be a flurry of atrial contractions. You'll have a flurry of contractions, and then you're going to have your QRS wave and then your T wave. And then maybe you'll have a normal sinus rhythm, and then maybe you'll get another flurry. Okay, so that's what the atrial tachycardia looks like. It's the atria that are beating too fast, not the ventricles, right? The third one then is called atrial fibrillation. And in atrial fibrillation, those are impulses that are occurring very fast in the atria. They can go up to like 500 beats per minute in the atria, very fast. And so the atria just, they quiver, 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 and the ventricles never have enough time to contract. So you never even really see the QRS wave. Then we're going to look at the ventricular arrhythmias. Okay, and the first one we have is called the PVC, or a premature ventricular contraction. And so you're going to see, it's not really dangerous, but like epinephrine can cause this, and you're just going to get the ventricle depolarization sooner than you should. It's premature. It happens sooner than it should. We also have VTach, or ventricular tachycardia, and this is where you get 4 or more PVCs in a row without a normal beat. So you're going to get QRS, 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 without seeing that repolarization or atrial depolarization. Okay, so that would be VTach. Tachycardia. The QRS waves are coming closer together. That's what ventricular tachycardia is. Atrial tachycardia are when the atrial depolarization, or the P wave, is coming closer together than it should. Right, then the last one we have is ventricular fibrillation, and this is dangerous. These are responsible for cardiac arrest. And this is where the ventricles are quivering and they stop pumping blood. And so you just see a huge mess. When you had ventricular or atrial fibrillation, you'd have the atria quivering, but then you'd see a QRS complex every now and then. That's in the atria, when the atria are quivering. But when the ventricles are quivering, you're not going to see any atrial, you're not going to see anything but the quivering. That's all you're going to see is that ventricular fibrillation. All right?